Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gil Eapen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gil@eapen.info. My guest today is Professor David Linden, who is a professor of the Department of Neuroscience at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. His lab has worked for many years on the cellular basis of memory storage, recovery of function after brain injury, and a few other topics. He's the author of 4 best-selling books on the biology of behavior for the general audience. His most recent book is Unique: The Science of Human Individuality. Welcome, David.
Thank you for having me on.
Sure, yeah. So the topic of our conversation is your most recent book that just came out, and it's about human individuality. When I think about humans, David, I see 8.3 billion people around the world. We seem to sort of micro-segmented ourselves into a variety of buckets by skin color, by language, by country. We have leaders of great democracies reminding us we are in different buckets all the time. So what do you mean by human individuality?
Well, what I really mean is all the traits, physical, behavioral, emotional, cognitive, that you can describe about a person. And the way that I began to think about this is about 5 years ago, when I found myself single in midlife, and I did as people do these days, and I went to an online dating website, and I was reading the profiles, trying to find a woman who I might want to have a conversation with, and it worked out very well. I met a woman who became my wife. She's wonderful, so there was a happy ending. But the nerdy side of me was reading the lists of traits that people have there that they use to describe themselves and wondering how they come about. So, some woman might say, well, I'm 5'11" and I'm bisexual and I have a Boston accent and I like bitter beer, but I don't like white chocolate. And, I tend to be a risk taker. And so I started thinking, well, gosh, how do these traits that make her an individual come about? So that's how it all got started.
Okay. And so we'll get into the book in detail. When I think about sort of human individuality, let me know if this works for you. I think about, sort of hardware, operating system, and software. We are all, sort of born with some hardware. There are some genetic components there. We come with some instincts, perhaps sort of an operating system that runs from right from the beginning, and then we start to put applications on top of it, and ultimately that computer is really a combination of all of these things, right? That is how the computer behaves. Is that a good analogy for humans?
No, not at all.
Okay.
It isn't, because by your analogy, the hardware would be changed as a result of experience too. In other words, your genome has 19,000 genes in it, approximately. But any given cell in your body at any time, maybe it's expressing 12,000 of those genes, and the genes are being turned on and off as a result of your experience. Yeah. Some of them are being turned off all the time. For example, you don't want the cells in your stomach lining to be growing hair, and you don't want the cells in your hair follicles to be secreting stomach acid. So those genes are turned off all the time. But many other genes are turned on and off as a result of your experience in the world. And by experience, I mean both social experience and also whether it's day or night, and the foods you eat and the bacteria that colonize your gut. So I think the computer analogy really fundamentally breaks down.
So that is what you mean by epigenetics?
Well, so epigenetics means the way in which gene expression is regulated, in which genes are turned on and off in various cells at various times. And there are some ways to turn genes off that are rather long-term, like if you want to shut off the hair-growing gene in the cells in the lining of your stomach, you might chemically add methyl groups to the DNA to do that. And then there are other ways of regulating gene expression that are more dynamic. For example, every day over the course of 24 hours, you have some genes that are highly expressed at night and some other ones that are highly expressed during the day. And they go up and down, up and down, up and down every day of your life. So there are different mechanisms to regulate gene expression when it's changing constantly.
And that could be happening with the environment and your experience, right?
Well, right. I think many of your listeners may have heard a term which I really dislike, which is nature versus nurture. And in my view, this term has done more damage than any other expression in the history of biology. I don't have a problem with nature as a sort of metaphorical, poetic expression to mean heredity, to mean the genetic influence. But the idea that everything that isn't heredity is nurture is just not true. Nurture means how your parents and your community raised you, or how they failed to, or how they abused you. And I think what's important to realize is that the non-hereditary things that influence your individuality are much broader than that. It's experience, not just social experience, and not just the sort of experience that can be written into memory, but everything from the diseases your mother was fighting off while she was carrying you in utero, to the average temperature in your first year of life, to the bacteria that colonize your gut. Experience, broadly considered, should replace nurture in the nature versus nurture expression.
Okay. So in the first chapter of the book, you have a very interesting experiment. So dogs came from wolves, domestication of wolves, and this is a much more recent experiment in Soviet Union, attempting to domesticate foxes?
Yes, that's right. This is a very interesting experiment because it's extraordinarily hard to do. It takes many tens of years, and so what they did is that foxes are grown on farms in the Soviet Union to harvest their fur for garments, and so the infrastructure already exists. But some scientists there decided, well, we want to see, can we make dog-like foxes? Can we, through a small number of generations, by picking those foxes that are the tamest and breeding them together, can we produce a dog-like fox? And so, what they did is they first looked at the foxes that were already there in the fur farm, and they tried to identify the tamest ones. And they would do things like put their gloved hand in the cage and see who didn't bite or who didn't cower. And they would take those foxes and breed them together, and then they take the offspring of them and see who are the tamest ones and breed them together. And after about 4 or 5 generations, they already started to see behavioral changes. in the foxes. And within 30 generations, they had foxes that were as loyal and as tame as any dog. Interestingly, while the only criterion they were used for this fox breeding was tameness, other traits came along as well. Curvy tails, the ability to patches of different colored fur on the face. And what some people think is what you are actually selecting for when you're selecting for tameness is the arresting of development of an early stage. So you get a sort of playful young fox in its characteristics. Interestingly, people have known for a long time that there's a domestication syndrome. So turning straight tails curly and getting patches of fur on the face, that happens not just in this fox experiment, but in all kinds of domesticated mammals.
Is it purely a selection effect, David, or is it something more systematic going on? So just 5 generations already getting to the end outcome that you're looking for.
Well, 5 generations didn't get you entirely to the end outcome. 5 generations got you to seeing something in the behavior that you could measure. It took 30 generations or more to really, I mean, and one, I don't know, I wouldn't even want to say it's the end outcome, because who knows? Maybe they're still changing. This experiment is still going on. As a matter of fact, if you want to buy one of these domesticated foxes, you can send $9,000 to some people in Russia, and they'll bring it over for you. You can have one as a pet, and a few people in North America do. But no, it took longer. But still, in the scale of evolutionary time, 30 generations is not very many.
So what I was getting to was, so if there is some random changes in the population, and then you're basically selecting what is good for you, are we seeing just a selection effect, or is there more sort of reinforcing effect, by spending more time with people and things like that?
Well, these researchers were very careful to not interact with the foxes beyond what they had to do to select them. After that, it's not like they took the foxes that they were going to breed the next generation and cuddled them and, had them have lots of human contact. So presumably it's just a selection effect. But I think what you bring up is a really interesting point. In other words, in order for selection to work, there have to have been some slightly tame foxes in the population to breed for the very first time. In other words, if all the foxes they had available to them were completely untame, there would be no way to get started. And that's what happened with zebras, because people tried to domesticate zebras. So, for example, in certain parts of Africa, there's sleeping sickness spread by tsetse flies, and horses can get the sickness. So you can't use horses very well in these parts of Africa, but zebras are immune. So people said, well, a zebra's kind of like a horse. Let's domesticate zebras, and then we'll solve the problem. But the problem is there were no slightly tame zebras to start with to breed together, so the project failed.
Right. Okay. So the sort of the initial conditions are quite important. Like you say, you have to get a few tameable things for the experiment to go on. Otherwise, you cannot.
That's right. There has to be variation, or there's nothing to select from. Right? If you have a population that are all identical, you're stuck. There's nothing you can change.
Yeah. So you have a number of very interesting studies in the book about twins and human twins, in an effort to identify, sort of the heritability part of human traits, and really experience part of human traits. You want to talk about a few of those cases?
Well, sure. So we can assign heritability estimates to certain traits. There are a few traits that are 100% heritable, like whether you have wet or dry earwax, and that's produced by variation in a single gene. There are a few traits that are not heritable at all, like speech accent. But most traits are at least either physical traits like height or behavioral traits like risk-taking and novelty-seeking, have some intermediate level of heritability. And the way we make these estimates, so I'll give you an example. The estimate for the heritability of height among people in the United States is about 85%. It's one of the most heritable traits that we know. And the way that we get that number is by measuring height, both in fraternal twins and also in monozygous twins, so-called identical twins, which in a moment I'll explain aren't really identical. It's sort of a misnomer. Yeah. And then by looking at twins that were either raised together or raised apart in different households. And then there's a standard equation called Fisher's equation that you can plug these numbers into, and it will give you an estimate for heritability. But the important thing about estimates of heritability is that they're only valid for the population in which they're measured. So I said that height, for example, was 85% heritable in people in the United States, and it's about the same in other affluent countries where people get enough to eat and they're not battling infectious diseases. But if you go to rural Bolivia, for example, where there's a lot of poverty, their height is only about 50% heritable. Why? Because people can't live up to their genetic potential for height because of malnutrition, because of battling infectious diseases, sometimes because of environmental hazards in the home or in the workplace. And so a heritability estimate comes from twin studies, but it's only valuable for the population which it's measured. And then the other thing that's really important to us about twins is that if you look at monozygous twins, the ones that people call identical in common speech, if you look at them even as newborn babies, they're not really identical, right? They don't look exactly the same. They don't have the same temperament. If you talk to parents of monozygous twins, they'll tell you. And so they're different, even though they have the exact same DNA. And even though they developed in utero lying right next to each other. So how is that? How does that come about? Well, it comes about through the pseudo-random nature of development. So your DNA isn't a precise instruction for every cell in your body, where it goes, where it migrates, and what it connects to. Rather, it's a set of rather general instructions. So for example, a population of neurons in the brain might get the general instruction, hey, grow towards the top of the head for a couple of millimeters and then cross over the midline to the other side of the brain and keep growing up to the top of the head. And the rest of you cells grow laterally out towards the ear. And in one identical twin, maybe 40% of the cells will cross the midline, and another one 60% will, because the instruction is not absolute. The genome is not a blueprint, even though there's a book with that as its title. It's not correct. It's not a blueprint. It's not a schematic diagram. It's a set of general instructions. And so if we are to go back and modify our expression nature versus nurture, what we would really come up with is something that's more cumbersome to say, but which is much more accurate, which is its individuality is produced by heredity interacting with experience, as we said, being very broadly considered, and filtered through the pseudo-random nature of development. It's not as fun to say as nature versus nurture, but it's more accurate.
Right. So even if the initial the instructions in the DNA are the same, there is sort of a probabilistic or stochastic outcome for the individual, yes. Right? All the complex wiring that needs to be done. It could also be quantum mechanical. There's some speculation that the brain is actually quantum mechanical, which makes it even more complex.
That's true, yeah. But my feeling is that you probably don't need to resort to a quantum mechanical explanation to understand individuality and precise cellular location uh, and and wiring. It's fun. There are some animals that make this really easy to study. So there's an animal called the nine-banded armadillo, and the nine-banded armadillo is always born as monozygous quadruplets, four identical babies. And if you take the armadillos and you measure their bodies in different ways, you put them in scanners, you dissect them if you're so inclined, what you find is that at birth, one of them might have a liver that's 30% bigger than the other, and the other one, might have more neurons on this side of the brain than that side of the brain. So these kinds of developmental pseudo-random variations are important as part of what determines our individuality.
Right. So we talked a bit about the nature versus nurture problem. Those terms are not the right terms, as you say. But on the experience side, you have an example here about the Japanese army invading the British Burma, and how some people sweat more than others. You want to quickly talk about the
Sure. So this is a great example of how non-social experience can change your individual traits. So in the beginning of World War II, when the Japanese invaded South Asia, they ran over the British Army and they invaded Malaya and Thailand and Burma, and they were on the doorstep of India by 1942, and the one problem that the Japanese army had is that a number of their soldiers were succumbing to heat stroke, rendering them temporarily unable to fight. And when the doctors in the Japanese army looked, what they found was that the soldiers that were more likely to have heat stroke were more likely to be from the colder northern parts of Japan, like the island of Hokkaido, whereas the soldiers who came from the southernmost major island of Japan, Kyushu, they were much more likely to be okay. So the classic genetic explanation for this that we might imagine is that, okay. And I'm sorry, I skipped something. So the other thing that they did is they did skin biopsies, because they thought that we know that the ability to sweat when it's hot helps cool down your core and prevents heat stroke. So they thought, well, maybe people who can tolerate the heat better have more sweat glands over their body. And that turns out not to be the case. That's not true. But if they look carefully, they see they have more sweat glands that receive nerve fibers from the heat regulating part of the brain. And that's important because those are the ones that help keep your body cool on a hot day, that can command sweating. And they found that there were truly more of them in the Kyushu soldiers, the southern soldiers, than in the Hokkaido northern soldiers. And so the classic genetic explanation would be, over many years in a cold place, it's been selected for you to have fewer innervated sweat glands, and in a warm place, you'd have more. But when they looked into this carefully, they found that wasn't true at all. In other words, if you had soldiers that came from long-standing northern families, but their families moved to the south right before the soldier was born, that soldier would carry the southern sweat gland phenotype with it. In other words, large, which is good for heat tolerance, and vice versa. If you had a long-standing southern family that moved to the north and then their child was born, that child would carry the northern phenotype. And so what it means is that this isn't a genetically encoded trait at all. It's actually determined by the ambient temperature in the first year of postnatal life.
So just the first year, it's remarkable that really differentiates it. You have a broader picture here. It says some diseases are significantly more prevalent in people born in particular seasons. And the variety of diseases that you indicate here, like ADHD, hypertension, asthma, and so on. And so these are statistically significant that if you're born in, let's say, fall, your chance of getting viral infections are higher?
Well, so I don't have this memorized. I'm actually going to the figure in the book. Yes, that's right. And of course, the fall means the seasonal fall. So it's going to be a different time of year, whether you're in the northern or the southern hemisphere. So, atherosclerosis is more likely in spring births, as is atrial fibrillation. Acute bronchiolitis more likely with fall births, as are viral infections. So this is work that was done by Nicholas Tontinetti's lab at Columbia University Medical Center. And what's nice about it is that they just went in and looked at enormous numbers of medical records with about 1,000 different diseases as categories, and they had no preconceived ideas about the relationship between time of year of your birth and disease. They just went in randomly and they said, like, what is it going to turn out to be? And they did this for specifically for people in New York City, but it has since been replicated in a number of other places in the world. And the interesting thing is that it's only a handful of the diseases that have these seasonal, they have, so of 1,688 conditions, only 55 were significantly influenced by birth month. So that's a small fraction, but of that small fraction, it's important. And, we don't always know the reason, right? You can make up stories about environmental allergens, for example, or temperature, but in many cases, we don't honestly know. We only know the epidemiological correlation.
Yeah, I grew up in India, and astrology, there is a big connection between your birth date and what's going to happen to you in many religions, in cultures there. I was wondering also, David, do we have any data on the COVID mortality against birth month?
No. No. There is some data for COVID, the incidence of COVID in time of year that's just starting to come out now, with an increased incidence in winter, as similar to what happens with influenza. I think, to me, the more interesting question comes from has to do with pregnancy, and this is inspired by a observation of women who were pregnant during the 1918-1919 pandemic flu. Women who were pregnant over that winter, that when we follow their children, they have a fourfold higher incidence of schizophrenia. So the incidence of schizophrenia goes from about 1% up to about 4%. And that's a very large effect. Even though the expression autism really wasn't prevalent at that time, we now know that the same is true for autism. And
these are mothers.
So the mothers were infected, but the increased incidence is in the child they were carrying, right? And we don't know entirely how this happens, but experiments in mice suggest that what happens is that as the mother is fighting off the viral infection, as part of fighting that off, she secretes a immune signaling molecule called interleukin-17A. And interleukin-17A can cross the placenta, enter the brain of the developing fetus, and if the fetal brain development is at exactly the right moment, it can influence the development of the neocortex of the brain in a way that seems to increase the probability of autism and schizophrenia. Now, what we don't know, and how this relates back to your question about COVID, we don't know if this is going to happen with other infections as well. In other words, it seems to happen with bacterial infections too. If a mother is fighting off a bad bacterial infection during pregnancy, there's also the same problem. So, the moms who are pregnant and who get infected with COVID, will their children over the years have a higher incidence of schizophrenia or autism? We don't know yet. And will take many years to find out, but it might be, unfortunately.
Yeah, this is a big issue, right? So when we think about optimum policy interventions, the disease burden that we are using to come up with an optimum intervention is all the short-term effects. And so if there are, in fact, long-term effects we have to think about, then, the policies related to herd immunity and stuff like that really
I
need to be
completely
rethought,
agree
right?
with you 100%. I mean, when I hear people in some political circles say, well, oh yeah, you get COVID and then you get over with it. And, unless you're a really old person, you're probably going to be fine. And then everything's fine. That's just so not true. We now know that there's a significant population of people that for which COVID infection produce a long-lasting, complicated syndrome with all kinds of unpleasant and poorly understood effects on multiple organ systems, from the heart to the brain to the liver to the immune system. And so, the idea that it's just the acute effects and if you don't die, you're all going to be fine and go back to normal, that's not true. And then, of course, when you add in a risk like the risk to developing fetuses, it only makes that strategy even worse. So we got to take COVID seriously. It's not just an acute disease that you get over.
Right. We will take a quick break, David. When we come back, we'll talk about the rest of the book. This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com. So we are back. So David, I want to go to the next chapter in the book entitled, I Forgot to Remember to Forget You. This is all about memory. The brain is a funny thing. It seems to fill in a lot of the missing information. It makes you believe things. You have a case here of that Oklahoma bombing, right? Timothy McVeigh and how ultimately they were caught.
Well, yes. So in the Oklahoma City bombing, Timothy McVeigh was the person who drove the bomb up in the truck and left it to kill over 100 people and many children in Oklahoma City, and he was caught rather quickly because his getaway car had no license plate, and the police pulled him over. But it turns out that he had rented his U-Haul truck from a nearby truck rental place, and when they went to interview the people in the truck rental place, one of them, the mechanic, one of three people who had witnessed Timothy McVeigh do the rental, say, oh, there was another guy with Timothy McVeigh at the time. And they said, oh, okay, well, we'll get a sketch artist here and you can do a drawing of him. And so they did a sketch artist. And your listeners who were around at that time will remember this face. It was a rather heavy-jawed, muscular-looking, scowly face, and he was called John Doe number 2. And this was the cause of the biggest manhunt in FBI history. Everybody, thousands of agents were mobilized hunting for John Doe number 2. All kinds of tips poured in. People say, oh, they saw him here, they saw him there, they saw him in this bar. And, driving down the road, they saw him with Timothy McVeigh running away from the car in Oklahoma City. But no one could ever find John Doe number 2. And the FBI investigated further, and they found out that the day beforehand, there was a guy who came in to rent a truck, and he looked a bit like Timothy McVeigh. And the guy he was with was a dead ringer for the sketch of John Doe number 2. And so the mechanic had done something that's very easy for us to do. I don't want to complain about him, because this is something that anyone could happen to. He had taken the memory of one day of this guy who wasn't Timothy McVeigh with a John Doe number 2 looking guy, and he had mixed that together with the memory of Timothy McVeigh coming in by himself in order to create a blended memory. And that's what gave rise to the entire mythical John Doe #2 wasted manhunt. And this is something that happens to us all the time. We're extraordinarily bad at eyewitness testimony. Thousands of people go to jail all the time based on faulty eyewitness testimony, and not for people who, are trying to be mean and people who completely believe that this is the way they remember things happening. Our memories are not built to be perfectly accurate. They're built to support decisions in a way that has been sculpted by human evolution. And the bugs, so to speak, in memory that make it less accurate are actually features, because they actually support decision making in most situations, although not all situations.
Right. Yeah. So there could be a power consumption thing there too. So the brain is, sort of trying to, let me ask you, brain is sort of trying to get things done by filling in missing information. And it might be optimizing to get the task done, and in the process, we might get a lot of make-believe stuff.
Well, so, some people say, well, there's a limited capacity for memory storage, so it makes sense to render memories generic. And the example that I always like to use is, if you've only been to the beach once in your life, you're probably going to remember a lot of details about it. But if you've been to the beach 100 times, you're probably not going to remember what happened on time number 57 with much detail, unless something very dramatic happened. On that particular visit. Rather, you will have folded it into a more generic memory of visits to the beach. But the truth is, a generic memory of visits to the beach is actually more useful to you in terms of most decisions you will make in your life about the beach than 100 perfect fidelity filmed with a movie camera kinds of memories. And in truth, memory is only useful when it's not a static thing like a photograph or something written on a file card, but when it can be constantly updated by its relationship to everything that happens after that and every time you recall it. So the fact that memory is dynamic and that it is rendered changeable when you recall it degrades the fidelity of memory, but in most cases actually increases the usefulness of memory.
Yeah, so isn't there some sort of a disease, David, that makes you really memorize all the details in great detail?
So there are a few cases in the literature of people who have so-called eidetic memories. That is to say, memories where they remember every detail of their own experience. And we don't always have a way of fact checking that, but it seems to be pretty true. It's very, very rare. And there's a famous example. There was a book by the Soviet neuropsychologist Luria that described one of these cases. But I think the thing, you might think, oh, well, that person's going to be a genius. Well, no, actually, it turns out that having a perfect memory for everything that ever happened to you is not that useful, actually. That you're, it's like you're trying to find facts. You're in this giant library with too many volumes, and you're trying to search around. So, the people with eidetic memories, that are generalized, oftentimes have a problem. They don't actually do very well making their way in the world. Sometimes people who have eidetic memories for certain things, like there are a number of people who can, upon one hearing, remember every piece of music that they've ever heard. Well, you could imagine that could actually be useful sometimes, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So you have a taxonomy here of long-term memory, and you make a distinction between explicit memory, memories of events, facts, and concepts, and implicit memory. You say it's acquired and used without conscious attention. Those are things like skills and habits, associative learning, sort of procedural memory. And so from a mechanistic perspective, do these things happen very differently in the brain?
Well, they seem to involve different parts of the brain. So, for example, there are places in the brain where if they're damaged, you really impact memories for facts and events. So many people have heard about the famous neurological case called HM, which was someone who had surgery to the temporal lobes to control intractable epilepsy. And a side effect of this was that they couldn't store new memory for facts and events from the time of the surgery onward. They also had a small retrograde amnesia going back a ways for facts and events. But HM could still learn, for example, to improve at a sport like ping pong or tennis. Could still learn to write by looking in a mirror, which is a very hard thing to do. And so in that sense, we know that the damage to the brain, to the temporal lobes that HM sustained seems to spare at least some forms of non-declarative memory. And we know that that there are damages to other parts of the brain that seem to impact non-declarative memory, but not declarative memory. It's not as if there's a perfect map and there's lots of overlap and interaction between the two, and we don't entirely understand it. But there is at least some distinction at the level of brain regions between these two general memory types.
In the chapter about sexual self, you talk about perhaps it's a misconception that sexual preference has no hereditary component to it.
Well, so I think there's one thing that's really important to make a distinction. The chapter Sexual Self is actually not about sexual orientation. It's actually about your identification, who you feel yourself to be, right? Okay. And these things are entirely separate, right? Who you feel yourself to be and who you're attracted to are separate issues with separate biology, separate genetics. If we are to talk about sexual orientation, what we see in twin studies is that there is a partial hereditary component. So for males, sexual orientation is about 40% heritable. And for females, and when I say females, I mean cisgendered females and cisgendered males, it is about only 20% heritable. So that means that there's a whole, I mean, these 20% and 40% are important, but they're far from the whole story. And so then the question becomes, well, what's the rest? And I think most people would guess with, oh, it had to do with how you're raised. This is the surprising thing. It doesn't appear to be at all, right? There's no aspect of child rearing that seems to have any influence on your sexual orientation whatsoever. I mean, there are cultural ideas. You might be raised in a home that disapproves of it, so you may, not want to express it early in life. You might try to repress it. But in terms of what you actually feel inside, doesn't seem to matter how your parents raise you. I think the important thing to realize is that there are biological factors that can impact a trait like sexual orientation that are not heritable. In other words, they're not what you inherit from your mother and your father. But
it's a random occurrence?
Well, not entirely random occurrence. So, for example, if you're a man who has older brothers, then you have a slightly higher chance of being attracted to men when you grow up. And it's a small effect, but it's a statistically reliable effect that's found all over the world. Likewise, we know that that women who in utero were exposed to unusual levels of androgens, that is masculinizing hormones, are more likely to be attracted to women when they grow up. So there are biological factors involved that are not heritable. But the truth is, there's still a lot of mystery remaining. It's not like we have a complete explanation for what accounts for variation in sexual orientation.
Yeah, so another complex interaction: genetic, biological, experience, environment, right? So we cannot really backtrack by just looking at the output.
Well, right. And I think another thing that's important is that this is actually kind of different in men and than women. And so if you talk to most men, they'll say, yeah, as soon as I was aware of having sexual or romantic feelings, they were this way. I was gay, I was straight, I was bi, and then it didn't change for the rest of my life. And 99% of men will tell you that story. And if you ask women, on the other hand, it's way more complicated. In other words, there's many women who will be the same thing. Oh, I always knew I was gay. I always knew I was straight. I always knew I was bi. But they're actually a very large significant fraction of women who actually have a more fluid kind of sexual orientation. And it's not necessarily that the sexual orientation changes, but something more complex than that. So, for example, you might have a woman who's been straight and attracted to men her whole life, who says, I'm not attracted to women, but I fell in love with this one particular woman. Right? Or likewise, you might have some woman who's always been attracted to women. She says, well, no, I'm not interested in guys generally, but I fell in love with this one particular guy. And there's a terrific book called Female Sexual Fluidity, published by Harvard University Press, that goes through this. But I think it's a really important and interesting thing. And that is, the whole concept of sexual orientation is a little different in cisgendered women than it is in cisgendered men.
So there's some commonality, but ultimately we are back to this idea that every individual is different, right? You don't really have predictability.
Well, we're I mean, at the genetic level, we're mostly the same. But all you have to do is go on the dating website and see how different people are. Right? Somebody likes this, somebody likes that, somebody looks this way, somebody looks that way, right? And a lot of these things are as a result of social experience and a result of cultural ideas. But a lot of it is genetic as well. I think what's interesting to me is that the notion that there is something in biology that pushes for individuality. And I'm thinking a lot about some fascinating work by an investigator at Harvard named Ben de Bivort. And Ben de Bivort studies genetically identical lines of flies, and he finds that they don't all have the same behavior, even though they're genetically identical. For example, some tend to turn left more, and some tend to turn right more when they're placed in a little T-maze. And if you take the ones that tend to turn left more and you breed them together, you don't get ones that predominate in turning left. You get half left and half right again, right? So it's as if there is something that is promoting behavioral individuality, probably through the pseudorandom process of development. And probably, I'm speculating here, but most, I think, evolutionary biologists would speculate and say, well, the reason for this is that if you have a population of critters and they all behave the exact same way, then they can all be wiped out when something catastrophic happens. Like if you got a bunch of insects and they all like to hide under leaves and none of them like to go out in the sun, then, when the environment under the leaf is going to kill you, then there's nobody left. But if there are a few weirdos who like to hang out in the sun, then maybe that population will survive. That's the kind of explanation, the class of explanation, that's put forward for why there seems to be a push for individuality in nature.
It's a fascinating book, David. We got through only a quarter of it. But in conclusion, so the book is unique, The Science of Human Individuality. You want to sort of summarize the book and what a reader might take away from it?
Well, I think people have heard a good summary about my reformulation of nature versus nurture. But rather than that, I'd like to make a slightly different point, and that is, you can hear that a trait is heritable, and you can hear that a trait is heritable in two different populations, and it might lead you to believe that the difference between the populations is therefore heritable. Let me give an example. Body mass index, how fat you are, is a fairly heritable trait, about 70% heritable in people in the United States. Now, on average, people in France have smaller body mass indices than people in America. Is that because of heritable genetic differences between French people and people in the USA? No, it isn't. It's because people in the USA eat more calorically dense foods and exercise less. So even though that trait is heritable, the difference between the groups is not heritable. And that's the thing that I would like to leave your listeners with.
Yeah, quick question on that, David. So if we assume that eating habits and exercise habits are correlated with BMI, so if your dad and granddad had those, let's call them bad habits, then you are at risk regardless of your efforts.
You only have some ability to change this. In other words, BMI is 70% of the variation in BMI is heritable. So, if you are battling with losing weight, you have an ability to affect that up to a certain point, right? But at a population level, you're kind of stuck with your genetics to some degree. So, I think what people should take from this is compassion, right? In other words, a lot of people look at people who are overweight and they say, well, that person has no willpower, right? If they just tried harder, they could lose more weight, and so there's no reason for them to be fat. And I think if we look at the heritability of BMI, what is revealed is that, that's really not the right attitude to have. It's not biologically supportable.
Yeah, I mean, it's hugely important. So 70% is a big number. And as you know, BMI is very closely related to type 2 diabetes, hypertension, expensive disease states. And so the interventions that we are suggesting in the medical arena, is it really considering this fact?
Well, I mean, I think the interventions can work up to a point. In other words, most people, depends how what weight they're starting at, but a lot of people who are overweight and looking to lose weight, they can lose 10% of their body mass and keep it off. But they're probably not going to be able to keep off more than that. In other words, they might be able to lose 20% of their body mass, but their chance of being able to sustain that weight loss is very, very low, because the brain is like a thermostat. It's a homeostatic mechanism, and it will do everything to turn down your metabolism and make you super hungry to make you try to hit that weight set point again. So, I don't want to be utterly pessimistic and say that nobody can ever lose weight and keep it off. But, for most people, the ability to do that is limited to a certain degree of weight loss. That on average for most people looking to lose weight is about 10%.
Right. Excellent. Yeah, it's a fascinating book. Thanks so much, David, for spending time.
Well, thank you. It was lots of fun.
And good luck with it. Yeah. Thanks so much. Bye. This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.